Hello, you're listening to In Search of Black Power. I'm Lawrence Grand Prix.
And I'm Lady Briar. In Search of Black Power is a podcast which challenges conventional narratives around Black policy, Black movements, and Black life.
We're coming to you from Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, a grassroots think tank in Baltimore, Maryland, with an extended platform, New Timbuktu. You can find out more at www.newtimbuktu.com.
For the past few episodes, we've been talking about the future and how we can imagine a Black utopia, but I recently saw a video which presented a very different vision for the future.
Oh, okay. Tell me more.
Well, it starts with a day not too far into the future, not too far from now, where pollution and economic malaise has settled over America. And just when it appears all is lost, a visitor from a faraway land arrives.
Ever since the alien signal was first received some 3 months ago, speculation has run rampant as to their appearance.
And they wouldn't be who they are without a little something with them. So, like all good traders, they came bearing gifts.
We are space traders bearing exquisite gifts that will restore your nation to its former glory. Nearly limitless quantities of gold and precious metals that will instantly erase your deficit. Machines that will renew your rivers and your air. Cold fusion technology for a safe, cheap, and inexhaustible source of energy.
Well, that sounds great in a Make America Great Again kind of way, right?
Yeah, but the price and the offer is one which no one expects, and America wonders if it could pay.
In trade for solving all your most pressing domestic catastrophes, we are asking for every person in your country that you would classify as Black.
Oh, I know this one. This is The Space Traders, the famous short story written by former Harvard Law professor Derrick Bell. But you should tell the rest of the story for the audience.
For someone seeing it for the first time, despite the cheesy early 90s aesthetic, it was very interesting. So the film cuts to the smoke-filled room of people making the decision where initial skepticism...
It's all bullshit, right?
...turns into excitement.
End of poverty? End of pollution?
Welfare rolls would be cut 40%. Food stamps, Medicare, drug abuse programs slashed.
In the face of a growing consensus, the one Black man in the room, Black Republican Professor Golightly...
Wow, that's really his name? Like he's a Black Republican, so it's like step likely around white folk?
Yeah.
Oh, Derrick Bell's low-key kind of petty, but I'm sorry, continue.
That's interesting, because I think that's his point. That although he's seen as a sellout, he's the only Black person in the room, and he actually uses his influence to push back against the deal.
Professor Golightly, you look like you want to say something.
As you know, Mr. President, I have been a lifelong card-carrying Republican. I sincerely believed, and still believe, Black people need to learn how to stand on their own 2 feet without the crutches of governmental legislation. But I'm afraid I must protest in the strongest terms possible what I've heard in this room today. What is being proposed cannot be passed off euphemistically as selective service. At its best, it is group banishment. At its worst, it is utter and complete extermination.
This was met with expected typical responses about...
Space traders seem perfectly nice and civil.
So what we're getting is ignorance about racism on literally a cosmic scale.
Exactly. Eventually, Professor Golightly works his business connections to explain to them how they should lobby against the deal. And this is where I think Bell really is landing his political message in an absurd but really interesting kind of way.
Blacks drink 33% of my hard liquor, 48% of my cognac alone. Who's going to take up that slack?
Why, it'll decimate athletic shoe sales.
Cool and Newport cigarettes.
Pork. Furthermore, the blacks are all gone. How long do you think poor whites will stand being at the very bottom of the barrel?
We buy up every minute of radio and TV airtime, every print ad, every billboard, even every goddamn bus bench, and we flood them with the anti-trade message, SOS, save our soul.
So in the face of a potential cosmic genocide of Black people, Golightly's big move is to sell the business class that Newports and Hennessy sales will decline if Black folks are taken by the space traders. I can imagine people feeling some kind of way about that.
Yeah, but again, I think that's his point. If we're so undervalued in America, how else can we defend ourselves but by finding places where our interests and the interests of those in power meet? But this process is harder than Professor Golightly thinks at first. The ad campaign rolls a message back on morality and pop culture.
Can you imagine life without jazz? No. Or without the blues? No. Or without rock and roll? No. Well, that's what life would have been like in these United States without the contributions of African Americans.
And the anti-traders are leading in the polls. But Professor Golightly has an epiphany which sends him running down the street to the nearest church where a meeting of civil rights leaders is being held. And here is where things actually get interesting.
In order to ensure victory, we must stop resisting the offer and urge the country to accept the traders' proposition.
Yep, and that's the big twist, that in order for black folks to not be traded to the space traders, Professor Golightly argues to his audience of black folk that we must stand up and make the whites think we want to go.
Right. And for a black Republican, he's saying a lot of things that a lot of black radicals might agree with.
Major motivation for racism in this country is the deeply held belief that black people should not have anything that white people don't.
But his conclusion is just so hard to accept. And in fact, in the story, he is shot down by an Al Sharpton type of civil rights leader.
Now is not the time for trickery and tomfoolery. My people were brought here involuntarily, and involuntarily is the only way they're gonna take me out.
So in the end, the activists don't change their tactics. They don't claim that they want to go with the aliens, and within the confines of white America's homes, they vote not with their hopes, but rather they vote with their fears.
Ladies and gentlemen, with just 6% of the vote tallied, we project that the referendum will pass by a comfortable margin. Collection centers will be set up tomorrow morning by the National Guard.
And as the whites of America enjoy a newfound technological bounty, the blacks of America are sent to an uncertain alien future.
And so as we say goodbye to our dark friends and neighbors, we say hello to a new era of American peace and prosperity.
Okay, so I had heard about this story a few years ago, and I was able to read it. And I saw this fictional rendition of Derrick Bell's Space Trader story a while back, but I think this was your first time seeing it. So when you saw it, how did you feel?
So after watching it, I was like, wow, although this is a spoof, it was eerily realistic, right? Like I could definitely see all the times where I had conversations about affirmative action or reverse racism or the Back to Africa movement, and the ways that white folks respond to those sentiments played out in this film. I also was thinking about, the response of the black folks, right? On the one hand, there was this disbelief, like, white America would not just send us to be with the aliens. Like, we've been undervalued before, but never to this extent. And it almost is proof positive of the way that people just forget the experiences of black folks in history. And towards the end, where you have the white bodyguard who is basically like, you knew what was going to happen all along. Like, why are you surprised? And they sort of go back on the deal that they gave about sending them to England if they helped out and all of this stuff. So it was really interesting. And I also saw a moment where I'm like, I feel like the notion of colorism is sort of being played out too, because it wasn't just all black folks, but instead it was the darker skinned black folks. And there's this moment where his wife is fair skinned and she's thinking that she's going to go with her husband, but because she's fair skinned, that doesn't happen. So there were just all of these very complex arguments being played out. And I just thought it was brilliant as a catalyst for deep conversations about really how black folks are valued in this country and what white folks won't do to achieve their hopes and dreams.
Yeah, and while that story may seem extreme for some, I think it became a lot less extreme after the election of 2016.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them have been crying.
This was a white lash against a changing country. It was a white lash against a black president.
This is the people rising up saying it's time to listen to us. It's time to listen to us in Michigan and Wisconsin and work for the people.
Hillary Clinton has called Donald Trump to concede the race.
Woo! If you don't speak English and don't contribute, get out.
Get out of here, Paul!
Say it, say it, say it!
Build that wall! Build that wall! Build that wall! Build that wall!
No Islam! Fuck political correctness! Fuck political correctness!
Amen! Right on!
Build that wall!
Fuck Islam! Fuck them! Fuck Islam! God bless Donald Trump! Thank you for not taking the shirt off. I did. Fucking A, baby. What's your problem with Trump? The Constitution says that religion is a right to keep tabs on that. Muslim is not a religion, partner. It's an ideology. You don't come and talk about America when you're supporting Muslims. Good luck to you.
Obama doesn't need a right.
Go to the polls and vote for Donald Trump.
Our president has divided this country so
Yeah, so what is the election of Donald Trump other than a backlash to Obama? And America didn't need the promise of new technology to make this trade, essentially. And in this moment, where people are not only asking, what should we do, which is something we've tried to address on this podcast, but also asking, how do you do it in face of unrelenting and mutating racism? I think now is more than ever, it's important for us to delve deeper into the story of the author of this story, Derrick Bell. Derrick Bell, ironically, was actually a professor that Obama had. And when the right realized this, they basically launched a smear campaign against Derrick Bell because some of the arguments he came up with, despite being a former civil rights lawyer, were so anathema to white America's beliefs on race that they called him a radical. They called him a nihilist, or basically hating white people. But he had arguments not just about how race works, but how we can use the way race works to our advantage. So I think it's important that we use space on this podcast to talk about the ideas that Derrick Bell came up with, why he basically changed his mind from being a civil rights lawyer to being someone who talked about the idea of interest convergence, that black folks only advance when it's in white folks' interest somehow to see them advance. And to not view that in the lens of despair, but to view that as a tool for how we can actually make change in the world today. So for many people, the first time they would have heard of Derrick Bell was a few years ago when he was the target of a Fox News firestorm.
Now, earlier this week, courtesy of Breitbart.com, we aired a rare piece of video from a 1991 protest showing Harvard student Barack Obama introducing a man by the name of Derrick Bell. Now, in case you missed it, here it is.
And I remember that the black law students had organized an orientation for the first-year students. And one of the persons who spoke at that orientation was Professor Bell. And I remember him sauntering up to the front and not giving us a lecture, but engaging us in a conversation. Open up your hearts and your minds to the words of Professor Derrick Bell.
Now, after he said, open up your hearts and minds to the words of Derrick Bell, well, then student Barack Obama hugged him. Well, Mr. President, that's exactly what we have now done over the course of the last 48 hours. And some of the words that we have uncovered are pretty disturbing. In fact, I think it's obvious why your friend, Professor Ogletree, went to great lengths to hide that protest footage during the 2008 campaign. Let's do as we were told and open our hearts and minds to the words of this controversial figure. Now, here he is talking about what it was that kept an old friend of his motivated during a time when racial tension was running high in the 1960s.
Why do you do it? And she said, Derrick, I'm an old lady. I live to harass white folks.
So even in the face of manufactured controversies, this one was especially manufactured. It was 2012, Obama was running for re-election, and needing something to pin on him, they essentially took this former professor he had and claimed him to be some sort of radical white hater. And one thing they did was to get a black professor, in this case Professor Thomas Sowell, and essentially use him to basically criticize Derrick Bell. Hello, it's Lawrence again to talk to you about why you should become an LBS sustainer. Here on In Search of Black Power, we've tried to explain how LBS might be a little bit different than other advocacy organizations or other folks doing podcasts, and I think the difference is experience. A brief story. I worked with a national think tank, and when Trump was inaugurated, they invited me to come to Washington, D.C. to be part of a protest in front of the MLK Memorial. This is some folks' dream. Retweets, Instagram, this incredible visual of me speaking in front of the statue of MLK. I chose instead to go to Annapolis, our state's capital, because we were lobbying on a relatively small statewide bail reform measure. But that, I think, encapsulates what LBS is trying to do differently. It's not about the visibility, it's about the impact, and we knew we had a bigger impact in Annapolis than we could in Washington, D.C. And what we're trying to bring you on In Search of Black Power is something that explains those interconnections. The activism impacts how we relate to our research, and that research impacts how we relate to our teaching. And when you become an LBS sustainer, you fund all the different branches of our organization. We work with youth, we do advocacy, and of course, we are building out the New Timbuktu project to continue to bring you autonomous intellectual innovation. So if this is the type of work that you feel is valuable, remember it can only exist independently with your support. So please go to lbsbaltimore.com/sustain today. Thank you. So that's where a lot of their attacks land on, this idea that I lives to harass white people. There's somehow being one of Derrick Bell's mantras, making him out to be some white person hater. And it's funny because it actually, in many ways for him, was the exact opposite of his political philosophy. And to explain Derrick Bell, you have to understand his life story. So I think we should look into how he became who he became. And Professor Bell doesn't actually seem to talk about himself very much. So here's Harvard Professor Randall Kennedy talking about Derrick Bell's background.
Derrick Albert Bell Jr. was he was born in Pennsylvania. He attended Duquesne. He was in the Air Force. He went to the University of Pittsburgh Law School. But when he got out of law school, there were no jobs available to him, and he was told that to his face.
So this is the 1950s, and the Department of Justice has just started its Civil Rights Division.
He got a job working for the United States government. He was in the Department of Justice.
So he goes to work there, but he essentially quits after he refuses to give up his NAACP card.
He was told that he had to resign his membership in the NAACP because as a lawyer for the Department of Justice, there was a feeling on the part of his superiors that there might be an untoward conflict. He refused to do that. And so he left. He left the Department of Justice.
A move that would prove fortuitous because it's in that moment where he meets the famous civil rights lawyer, the most famous civil rights lawyer of all times, Thurgood Marshall.
Was working for the NAACP, and Thurgood Marshall paid a visit, saw Derrick Bell, and offered him a job. Most of what he did there was litigation in the Deep South.
And this is where he cuts his teeth. So under the great Thurgood Marshall, Derrick Bell would be there for some of the great moments of civil rights history.
He was one of James Meredith's lawyers. He was also the lawyer for some students who were expelled from college. They were expelled from Alabama State College. Case called Dixon versus Alabama State College. And Dixon is a very important case because it represented the first time that federal courts recognized that students had federal constitutional rights.
So after this experience, Derrick Bell goes into the legal academy, the world of legal academia. He writes really the first major book on racism and law in the legal academy, Race, Racism, and the Law. And he becomes the first person ever to receive tenure at Harvard Law School. But then something starts to shift. He goes from the hope of the 60s to the malaise of the 70s. He doesn't see progress on busing or desegregation. He doesn't see progress on diversity on the staff at Harvard. And he was actually willing to take a stand against it.
Derrick Bell took the position that the law school was not doing a good job of diversifying its faculty. And in particular, he thought that the fact that there were no black women on the law school faculty was a big problem. And eventually he gave the law school an ultimatum. He said, listen, I've been complaining about this, and if nothing's done about it, I'm going to take a leave of absence. And indeed, he did take a leave of absence.
So faced with a question about his commitment and standing on his principles, he made the only decision he felt he could make.
And after 2 years, there's a rule here at the university, if you take a leave of absence for 2 years, you have to either rejoin the faculty or you leave. And there had been no change. There were no black women on the faculty, so he left. I'm sure that this is a first in the history of Harvard Law School.
So he lost his job.
Yeah, he didn't just lose a job. He lost the job. He was the first black tenured professor at Harvard Law School. This is almost hard to explain how monumental this was.
Wow.
And the fact that he was willing to leave it, I think, was emblematic of his understanding that he had to refine his vision on how race worked. And
Right.
even when you seemed to go forward, why were you moving forward? Could there be forces at play that maybe put a cap on the progress you're really making? And could there be some interest in granting strategic concessions? And this is where his work begins to turn around this concept of what he calls interest convergence. Here's a clip from Georgetown law professor Paul Butler explaining this idea that Derrick Bell is famous for coining about interest convergence.
The truth as described by Derrick Bell is that the United States of America is a white supremacist country where black people will only advance if that's in the interest of white people. And even then, that advance will be cyclical. A period of what looks like progress will be inevitably followed by a period of what's certainly retrenchment. And that if you're a person of color in the United States, the main thing you can count on is the permanence of racism.
So the most famous example Derrick Bell gives, and really the most controversial, one of the things that drove a wedge between him and Harvard eventually, was the idea that Brown versus Board of Education, though lauded as really the greatest civil rights advancement of all times, is really just an example of interest convergence. And to understand his argument, you have to understand the story of the 1950s. So here's the context. The Cold War is raging. Many people think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but before that, America went to war in Korea. And it was one of the wars where a lot of black soldiers actually served. And if you understand the history of civil rights, after every war where black soldiers serve, there's a huge concern that black soldiers will come home and basically demand progress on the civil rights front. So that was a real concern in the American government about this coming to fruition in the 1950s. Not only that, but you have to remember what the Cold War was really about. There were two competing ways the world could move forward. Capitalism, United States, communism, Soviets. And the Soviets were using racism in America as a massive propaganda tool to claim that this is what you got from capitalism. You got racism, you got violence against minorities. So Derrick Bell's argument, in a nutshell, is that it is this concern about negative public relations coming in the context of the Cold War, the Soviets calling America racist, that is a huge driver for why the symbolic decision of Brown v. Board comes down exactly where it does, in the 1950s after Korea. So Derrick Bell's actually been kind of derided for this argument. Most people don't believe that this idea of public relations on race against the Soviets could be that big a deal that it can move a Supreme Court decision. And honestly, I kind of felt this way too. But the more I looked into it, the more I understood just how serious this question of America's depiction of race was in the 1950s. Francis Stoner Saunders wrote a book entitled The Cultural Cold War, where they actually detail that CIA agents were actually strategically placed into Hollywood to improve the depictions of black people in Hollywood movies. An actual quote from the book, it says that the particular CIA agent, whose name is Carlton Assop, reported that he had secured the agreement of several casting directors to plant, quote, well-dressed Negroes as a part of the American scene without appearing too conspicuous or deliberate. So just to hammer this home, Brian, I actually want to show you a couple of clips from movies made in the 1950s. So I want to show you the first one, which is called The Caddy, which is a film starring the famous comedian Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin. And I want you to see if anything looks out of place. So just to set the scene for the audience, we're at a very well-heeled golf club. You have someone just about to knock the ball off the tee. You have a large crowd in the background. Jerry Lewis is eating, looks like a sandwich, making some jokes about how he loves Ben Hogan. And right there.
The one Negro in the back.
And remember, this is a golf club in the 1950s.
Absolutely.
What are black folk doing in a well-dressed black folk doing at a golf club in the 1950s? They're not supposed to be there.
Absolutely.
And yet there he is, right there. And in the book, Saunders explicitly says this film is one of the films that Carlton Assop intentionally placed black folks in the background.
Wow. I mean, he does look dapper.
Great. And again, the idea is that this film is going to travel around the world. Jerry Lewis is a huge star. And it was so important to America that America be seen as racially inclusive that they were willing to infiltrate Hollywood studios and place black people into scenes where they literally make no sense. All right, so next film. This is a film called Sangare. It's a period piece in the 19th century. And Assop notes in his notes that he was concerned that because it was a period piece, it would be hard to place black folks in the background, happy and dapper. So he places them into the story in an interesting way. So just to set the scene for the audience, period piece, 19th century, very well-dressed white man is engaging in a conversation with a black person who he thinks is a servant.
Listen. Yes, sir? Haven't I seen you before? I couldn't say, sir. Yes, your name's Briar. You were at the reception the night I arrived in Savannah. I thought you belonged to Mrs. Darby.
I am a freedman, sir. I work where I am paid.
Yes, of course. And these are very, very pleasant surroundings, eh?
So this dialogue has literally nothing to do with the movie. It is a scene intentionally placed into the film by Carlton Assop, a CIA agent, just so the audience knows he's not a slave.
True.
In order to have positive public relations in the context of the Cold War.
Yeah, I often have to say that phrase, too, that I work where I'm paid.
And, again, so the point is that Derrick Bell was seeing this all the way back in the 70s, that the depictions of America didn't just occur in media. It occurred in our legal system. So policymaking itself could be a tool of propaganda. And if you look at the way the Brown decision is written and is actually applied, Bell's argument is that it can almost only be understood as a symbolic victory whose propaganda purpose was far, far greater than the desire to materially integrate schools.
What we didn't recognize is that Brown came about in 1954 rather than years. School desegregation suits had been filed since 1850. And what we didn't realize is that in 1954, we had what I call, in some other word, the interest convergence.
Yes.
That is, blacks only, and I think other groups too, but blacks dramatically only make progress not when they are suffering serious injustices, including slavery or segregation, not when they are able to make great proof of this suffering available in courts or what have you, but when the policymakers recognize that what the blacks are seeking will serve their interests, will further their interests. And in the 1950s, remember, that was the McCarthy era.
Right.
2 years before was Dennis versus United States, where they sent these 4 scholars to prison for a long time under a conspiracy statute, the Smith Act, for teaching Marx and Trotsky and what have you. Teaching, that's all the proof they had. And yet, there was such fear that about the communist countries making a big deal with regard to the segregation here and what have you. There was a fear here that blacks coming back from the war were not going to take this stuff anymore. So that this decision served to improve our foreign relations and could kind of make serve as a proof that, well, this country wasn't so bad after all. And so everybody applauded.
So this is sort of the latent underlying reasons that
I think
okay,
it's not any opinion.
Go ahead.
But what the proof of it is that the very next year, when white folk, which this court was fearing, rose up and they were going to succeed and everything else, the court backed away. They didn't honor the NAACP lawyers who wanted immediate desegregation, which might have worked better than what they sent it back with this all deliberate speed, which the South interpreted as never.
And it's this realization that makes Bell reflect on all his work. Even his greatest civil rights victories in Mississippi can be seen within the lens of a public relations victory in the campaign against the Russians.
James H. Meredith is formally enrolled at the University of Mississippi, ending one chapter in the federal government's efforts to desegregate the university. The town of Oxford is an armed camp, following riots that accompany the registration of the first Negro in the university's 118-year history.
For any government of laws and not of men, no man, however prominent or powerful, and no mob, however unruly or boisterous, is entitled to defy a court of law.
And it comes across as a victory for the United States, not despite the white backlash to James Meredith, but exactly because of it. Look how strong the rule of law is here in the USA, that we'll even take on our own southern racists to protect the minority. No Hollywood producer could think up better propaganda for liberal capitalist democracy. And James Meredith himself narrates his experience very differently than the typical civil rights narrative. He, in fact, gives the exact same argument Derrick Bell does.
And at this time, what the whole thing up at Ole Miss is about is saying that we have given you these 3 or 4 of your rights, and it's progress, and you ought to be happy about it.
So what has changed in the South?
Absolutely nothing. I went to war 50 years ago, and I'm still at war.
But many would argue that integration is a good thing.
And this is the perception that Derrick Bell has struggled with ever since the 60s. So this is Derrick Bell's argument that when integration really happened, what people wanted was better schools. And what they got was limited access to white schools, which is part of the reason why many use the term desegregation and not integration, because they didn't want this mythology. They just wanted to be next to white folk. They wanted acknowledgement of their humanity and the access to options. But when folks from the North came down, all they wanted to do was win the case. And the case actually gave them access to the worst white schools, or limited access from the black bourgeoisie to a few decent white schools, which was not the original intent of many of the activists who brought these cases in the first place. One argument you'll hear sometimes is that test scores went up in the era of integration, so it had to have worked. And Derrick Bell and others turned this argument on its head, and they explained that if those folks scored well, it's because they were so well educated in their segregated schools by black teachers who saw it as their life's mission to prepare these black kids for success. And it was these very same black teachers who were fired, in many cases, in the world of integration. And this is the reality that Derrick Bell forces us to confront in his work. And it's a reality that can be deeply frustrating in a world desperate for optimism.
You argue that racism is an integral, permanent, and indestructible component of this society.
Yeah.
It's irremediable?
Probably. There are many components, but one of them is to have a group identifiable who are deemed on the bottom. Even when they rise up, they're still on the bottom. Oh, there's exceptions. And so with that system, which we've been practicing for 300 years or more, even the lowliest, no account, unimpressive white man or woman can feel that somehow I'm superior.
So when we go back to the phrase that we started off this section with, I live to harass white folk, you can understand why Derrick Bell used that phrase. It wasn't an acknowledgement of pure pessimism. It was actually an acknowledgement of optimism, of being willing to struggle in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, and how he was so inspired by the work that he saw black folk in the South doing, that he owed it to them as a professor to tell the truth about what he saw race being in the world.
Peace, everybody. My name is Lady Briar. I'm the cultural curator at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. And I came to this organization because I really wanted to have an impact on Baltimore, specifically Black Baltimore. And as an artist and curator, I recognize that the lofty ideas of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle is often missed by, your average day folks who don't speak that really highly intellectual, scholarly language. So I use my art and my advocacy to reach those people. And currently, I'm working to create a Black arts district in West Baltimore. And your money as a sustainer can help not only support this podcast, but to support that work in West Baltimore. So please give $2, give $10, give $15 a month to help support the efforts of the Black Arts District, this podcast, and the general work of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Simply visit lbsbaltimore.com/sustain to sign up.
So, Brian, we've had a conversation about Derrick Bell, interest convergence, and the reality of racial advancement being fraught, potentially an illusion. But we need to now have a conversation about how, if possible, we turn interest convergence to our benefit. So I have a question. Have you heard of the story of Briar Rabbit?
Yep, I know a little bit about it.
Okay, so it's a classic folk story from the American South, rendered into popular culture by a famous cartoon. In it, Briar Rabbit, our lovable trickster hero, is caught by Briar Fox and Briar Bear, and they're looking forward to cooking them.
I'm gonna knock his head.
And just when it seems all is lost, our trickster hero sees a patch of sticky thorns. And the rabbit tells his captor Briar Fox and Briar Bear that tossing him into this briar patch would be the worst thing that could ever happen to him.
But there's one thing I don't want you to do. Huh? What's that? Brother Fox, I mean, whatever you do, Brother Fox, whatever you do, please, Brother Fox, please don't fling me in that briar.
And he's so convincing that Briar Fox ends up thinking that this punishment is actually his idea, and it'd be the worst thing that he could do to Briar Rabbit.
I'm glad I thought of that. Yes, indeed, I swear I'm glad I thought of that. But you ain't gonna bring me in there, is you?
And he dramatically tosses him in. Our hero appears to be no more. But just when it appears that all is lost,
Yes, sir, Brother Fox. I was born and bred in the brown patch. Yes, sir.
exactly, born and bred in the briar patch. Like, where else do rabbits live but in bunches of thorns? So he got the fox to toss him back into his home, thinking it was some sort of terrible punishment.
Born and bred in the briar patch. Born and bred in the briar patch.
So yeah, that's interesting. It reminds me of a lot of the Anansi stories in West Africa. And so I guess you're alluding that there's something more here.
Yeah, I mean, I think even that old racist Disney cartoon can't totally strip this story of its power. Briar Rabbit is a manifestation of the trickster figures in African and even Native American mythology. So in the face of a superior opponent, he's figured out how to make his adversary act in a way which is actually beneficial to him, but it appears to be just the opposite. And that's where I think the link to Derrick Bell comes in. He at times becomes almost more of a short story writer, than a traditional legal scholar. And one of his stories, I think, gets to the heart of the link between the Briar rabbit tail and what Derrick Bell is talking about when he's talking about interest convergence. So in addition to the story about the space traders, he has other fictional narratives and even fictional characters he uses in his work. One of these stories is called The Last Civil Rights Act, where he is attempting to challenge his audience to imagine new forms of civil rights law, which takes the reality of interest convergence into account, even if it's painful.
Right. So what we're going to do next is a fictional email correspondence between Bell and his fictional mental conscience, Geneva Crenshaw. It's a dialogue between a fictional version of Bell and a character he created as his radical foil, a legal scholar named Geneva Crenshaw. A shout out to the Black female legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, famous for coining the term intersectionality, who Bell credits in challenging and expanding his thought. We've taken some artistic liberty with this story, especially with the first letter, which we created to put this story in a modern context. But everything after that is mostly from Derrick Bell's story, The Racial Preference Licensing Act, a segment we've chosen to rename Operation Briar Patch. Derrick, my dear friend, we've gone over this before, but I'm afraid I have to bring this to your attention again. Our strategies for racial advancement have been revealed to be limited at best. In the face of these desperate times, desperate measures appear necessary. That's why I've hatched a plan, one I call Operation Briar Patch. Our president wants nothing more than to denigrate Black people, so our hope is to use this vindictive desire to our advantage. I propose that we use our connections within the moderate right to seed a radical proposal into a prominent conservative think tank.
Good afternoon. My name is David Azarad, and on behalf of the Heritage Foundation, I would like to welcome you to this Russell Kirk lecture on modern liberalism and America's racial divide.
Though this proposal is from us, it will meet demands of interest convergence and be championed by the right. And in order to ensure it passes, we will vehemently oppose it in all ways.
Donald Trump, the fascist Trump! Stop! Trump, the fascist Trump! Donald Trump, the fascist Trump!
And while it will be hard to swallow, the bill will pass and will allow us to benefit from the discrimination whites already do now and likely will do forever.
Right to Free Association is back, baby, and in a huge way. We came into this saying that we were good for the blacks. Our support's been tremendous. And even though the snowflakes won't like it, I am happy to be here to announce the completion of what MLK and Rosa Parks started, the last Civil Rights Act. Under the new act, all employers and owners and managers of dwellings and places applicable to federal government could obtain a license authorizing the holders or their agents to exclude or separate persons on the basis of race and color. The license itself will be expensive, but not prohibitively. And after obtaining that license, the holder will be required to pay the government commission, a tax, equal to 3% of the income derived from employing, serving, or selling to whites during each quarter in which the policy of racial preference is in effect. And we're going to enforce it. We're going to enforce it bigly. Believe it. We will finally create the balanced and pragmatic response to racial injustice that we've been desperately seeking, and give us the legal and political foundation to finally make America white. Make America great again.
Doesn't sound like me.
While this will be hard, think about all the community banks, African-centered schools, and restorative justice programs this bill will fund, all for nothing more than taxing the practices whites do now in the status quo. Like Briar Rabbit, tossed into the briar patch, we will cry and howl, and silently we will go back and rebuild our village. Please respond when you can. Yours in the struggle, Professor Geneva Crenshaw.
Dear Geneva, my God, woman, what are you trying to do to me? Your odious proposal will earn me enmity from the civil rights community. Suggesting a black bonus-based return to state-sponsored racial segregation is simply going too far. God might be dead, but the 14th Amendment, though wounded, still lives, realistically. Derrick.
Dear Doubting Thomas, O ye of little faith, even after all these years, you remain as suspicious of my truths as you are faithful to the civil rights ideals that events long ago rendered obsolete. Whatever it costs to your relationship with your civil rights friends, why can't you accept the inevitability of my Operation Briar Patch? Now I can hear you asking, how do the rules justify my Racial Preference Licensing Act, which looks like a new, more subtle but hardly less pernicious separate but equal law? Let me try to explain. Derrick, today, as it did in the mid-1890s, the Supreme Court is reacting to a range of social forces that are hardening racial attitudes. Whites, as they did a century ago, are concluding that the country has done enough for its racial minorities. The never vigorous enforcement of civil rights laws has slowed, encouraging open violations and discouraging victims from filing complaints they fear will only add futility and possible retaliation to their misery. What the president calls the final Civil Rights Act is, in fact, a manifestation of your rules on how race in America works. The society, or much of it, has tired of its commitment to protect blacks against the preference of whites. Because of the Equality Fund, they are able to rationalize and return the legalized segregation by viewing this as the necessary means to reach the black reparations end long sought by black groups. Your challenge is to determine whether in this, as in any seemingly hostile racial policy making lies unintended potential that African Americans can exploit. Think about it, Derrick. Legislation like the final Civil Rights Act may be all African Americans can expect and could prove all that they need. Prophetically, Geneva.
To Miss Geneva Crenshaw, dear Geneva, even as a vehicle for discussion, I cannot accept the legalized reincarnation of Jim Crow. Too many of our people suffered and sacrificed to bury those obnoxious signs, colored and white. Your Civil Rights Act will simply squander our high principles in return for a mess of segregation-tainted porridge. Victory on such grounds is no victory at all. Resolutely, Derrick.
To Professor Derrick Bell, dear Derrick, tell me, what principle is so compelling that you continue your support for obsolete civil rights strategies while ignoring the contemporary statistics regarding devastated neighborhoods, illiteracy, unemployment, and welfare dependency? Segregation was hateful, but if I knew that its return would reduce the devastation of black communities to the anti-desegregation levels, I would think such a trade entitled to serious thought, not self-righteous dismissal. You and other civil rights policymakers must realize that you have been formulating your strategies without any real assessment of the continuing importance of racial subordination of black people to the stability of the American economic and political system. You readily and pessimistically recount the developments marking the end of the Second Reconstruction and the parallels with the end of the First Reconstruction a century ago. But you do not see the critical connection between the social subordination of blacks and the social stability of whites. The fact is, friend, you do not have forever to see my point.
Wait. Oh, you're here. Welcome, Geneva. Is it your practice to visit folks while still at work at 2 a.m.?
I decided our computer correspondence was inadequate to convey the real significance of the final Civil Rights Act. Racism is more than a group of bad white folks whose discriminatory tendencies can be controlled by well-formed laws vigorously enforced. It is a non-negotiable, essential element of America as we know it. Belief in the superiority of their whiteness leads many whites to accept unthinkably a status that is often as disadvantaged as that involuntarily held by blacks. It is tied to the existing economic system and serves as a principal stabilizer of that system.
But Geneva, whatever happened to we shall overcome?
Racist opposition has polluted and transformed the dream that phrase once inspired into a myth that comforts and distracts you from the harsh racial reality that is closing in around us and ours. Don't you see? Just as parents used to tell children stories about the stork to avoid telling them about sex, so we hold to dreams about a truly integrated society. A fundamental principle in psychotherapy is the inevitability of death for each of us and for those we love. Yet, we devise a myriad of ways to escape or deny the terrible reality of death. We chuckle and say, "I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there when it happens." The fact is, full awareness of death ripens our wisdom and enriches our life. A dying patient recognizes this when he stated, "Though the physicality of death destroys us, the idea of death may save us." Derrick, the analogy is not exact, but just as death is inevitable and inherent in life, so racism is in America. While not inherent, it is intractable. It is socially constructed, but no less real. We must deal directly with American racism just as we do with death. Civil rights advocates and their organizations must face the unavoidable truth that this nation's social stability is built on a belief in and a determination to maintain white dominance. Racism is the manifestation of this deeply entrenched determination. It plays a key role in a capitalist society where the growing gap between the wealth of the rich and the poverty of the rest of the populace is both large and obscene. But even a total reform of our economy would not erase and might intensify the need of whites to measure their self-worth by maintaining blacks in a subordinate status.
Geneva, what you're saying sounds like a prescription for terminal despair. As applied to your Racial Preference Licensing Act, it simply sounds too risky.
It is risky. It is an approach with risks quite like those we must face as we seek the salvation in life that comes when we accept the reality of death.
But Geneva, if death and racial subordination are inevitable and unavoidable, if all our efforts and accomplishments will come to nothing, then what is the meaning of life? And then what is the value of working for civil rights?
As discouraging as that sounds, it seems to me that when we ask that question aloud, we are dealing directly with the unstated question that has bedeviled us all along. Out in the open, we can forthrightly deal with the seeming paradox of a people long opposed by law, continuing to look to law for remedies that elude or grasp, deceive our minds, and frustrate our hopes. Today, even the worst racist denies that he is a racist. Black people, moreover, will no longer have to divine whether an employer, a realtor, or proprietor wants to exclude them. The license will give them and the world ample notice. Those who seek to discriminate without a license will place their businesses at risk of serious, even ruinous penalties. It may seem crazy, but racism is hardly based on logic. We need to fight racism with racism the way a forest ranger fights fire with fire. Civil rights advocates must face up to the racial realities of American social and economic stability and try to structure initiatives and responses in the light of the racial world as it is, rather than as they would like it to be. Well, I have to go. You are as impossible as ever, but I've missed you nonetheless.
Could I have fallen asleep and imagined what happened? But no. There on my monitor was all of our conversation, miraculously transcribed and ready to insert into my now completed chapter. The notion of a license to practice racial discrimination in the 21st century seemed absurd, but no more so than the reality of worsening racism as we approach an uncertain future.
So, Lawrence, coming out of this retelling of Derrick Bell's story between a version of himself and Geneva Crenshaw, what do you think that the audience should glean from this story?
I think maybe they understand why Derrick Bell was controversial on the left. Many folks on the left didn't like Derrick Bell because they thought he was denigrating the work they had done in the civil rights world by questioning it. But also, I think folks should understand what he was trying to do is not typical of a law professor. Most law professors are into technical minutia, writing law review articles that have nothing to do with real-world people. He was trying to educate the country into a radical new way of confronting what he saw as racial reality. And it's a lesson I think we are trying to have more people exposed to so they can hear what he actually said and what he actually saw it. Because these are the lessons that, for example, we at LBS are trying to understand and integrate into our work in ways that actually make the proposals we put forward stronger and more durable in the face of interest convergence and white racism, to make our work stronger, not to denigrate anyone else's work. And I think that he's someone who people really love, but I always wonder why he's not more famous. To me, he should be on the tongues of people all over the country who are doing racial justice work. And I think he is just such a hard person to grapple with, because you have to grapple with the ideas that he's putting forward.
In thinking about LBS or other organizations that are really trying to make change on behalf of Black people, like, how would interest conversion be beneficial? If
you don't take interest convergence into account, you're in for a bad time. The classic example of this is Obama and Obamacare. I always wonder, and if I ever talk to Obama, this would be my one question. If you had Derrick Bell as your professor, why did you do Obamacare the way you did? Because interest convergence would dictate that white people would value their sense of whiteness more than material benefit and would backlash against it, which is exactly what they did. Like, most of the poor people getting food stamps are white. A lot of the people getting Medicare are also white. But Republican governors chose to reject free money to expand their Medicaid and Medicare systems rather than capitulate to a Black president. Like, we know that, we figured as much. I have a piece online projecting as much would happen because, amongst everything, I'd read Derrick Bell. And that fact that Obama couldn't conceptualize that racism would overwhelm material preference, to me, felt like he was a bad student of Derrick Bell. So if white people are thinking this way, if this is part of our way of doing politics, we have to account for that. So one thing I struggle with LBS is Maryland's probably going to legalize marijuana recreationally. And with that, it's going to come tax revenue. So I struggle with, how do I make the argument that tax revenue has to go back to Black neighborhoods destroyed by the war on drugs? One thing interest convergence could say is, look, white people are afraid of crime. And if weed is legal, all the people currently selling weed illegally will be out of business and have to take up other businesses, like potentially robbing people. But I don't like making that argument because it feels like you're falling into tropes about Black super predators. But if that's a pragmatic argument to make, because that's one thing interest convergence could lead you to dictate, I at least have to think of it. And I have to take those type of arguments seriously. And that is the lesson I directly pull from Derrick Bell. It's understanding that in order to give Black people what they need, we have to see racism as a reality and the world as it is, not how we want it to be.
We started this podcast on space traders, another story written by Derrick Bell. And it ends with a sort of cliffhanger. Everyone is being taken to space, and we don't know what happens. So what do you think? Or is there a story out there that gives the ending to Space Traders? It's funny, because if you actually read Derrick Bell's collection of works, I didn't know this until about a year ago. He actually did write a conclusion to the Space Traders story. And in it, the Black folks get to the spaceship and realize that the space traders had come to pick them up because they had experienced so much racism in America. So they're offering them basically this lavish life on their home planet. But the space traders can't understand why the Black people are so sad and so angry. They thought they'd be happy to leave. So a debate actually breaks out between, of all people, Professor Golightly arguing that Black folks should go back, and Geneva Crenshaw arguing Black folks should go with the space traders. And neither of them really win the argument per se,
But because the space traders can't figure out what to do, they basically agree to provisionally send them back home. And people break out into song, Amazing Grace and Negro spirituals, because at this moment, people do what they do and know what they know. And I think it's Derrick Bell saying, I don't have all the answers, but for better or worse, this is the country we have. This is the world we have. In the face of that, we have to do everything we can to grapple with these questions and actually have that debate in a way that hopefully can get us to see ways that we can advance in the future.
So I want to read a poem entitled Frederick Douglass by Robert Hayden, which was actually dedicated to Derrick Bell by one of his former students, Paul Butler, at an event. And so I want to end with this. When it is finally ours, this freedom, this liberty, this beautiful and terrible thing, needful to man as air, usable as earth, when it belongs at last to all, when it is truly instinct, brain matter, diastole, systole, reflex action, when it is finally one, when it is more than the gaudy mumbo-jumbo of politicians, this man, this Bell, this descendant of slaves, this Negro beaten to his knees, exiled, visioning a world where none is lonely, none hunted, alien, this man, superb in love and logic, this man shall be remembered. Oh, not with status, rhetoric, not with legends and poems and wreaths of bronze alone, but with the lives grown out of his life, the lives fleshing his dreams of the beautiful, needful thing.
Thank you for listening to In Search of Black Power. Make sure to follow us, like, and subscribe on Twitter and Instagram at LBS Baltimore and on Facebook at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. You can find this podcast at www.thenewtimbuktu.com and on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you can find podcasts. You can also support us and become a sustaining member at www.lbsbaltimore.com.
In Search of Black Power was created by Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, hosted by Lawrence Grand Prix and myself, Lady Briar. Our associate producer is Iyori Odigizuwa, and our engineer is Justin Gladden. Our research assistant is Aaron Brown, logistical support from Nadira Smith, and a thanks to the whole #LBS gang. We'll see you next time in Search of Black Power.